And Francois Couperin was actually the one responsible. He was actually the first keyboard pedagogue. He wrote a book on the art of playing, l'art de toucher, so the touch, no, the art of the touch, le clavecin, which means the keyboard. At that time, they didn't have pianos yet, so it was the harpsichord. And the harpsichord didn't have any dynamics. Okay, do you understand what I say when I say dynamics, right? When I explain to my students, I say, well, dynamics is kind of like when you turn on the volume of the radio or the TV. I don't think you do this anymore, no? You don't have TVs in your time where you turn it on like that or like that. I think everything now is you press or everything is touch, no. So when you turn it louder, or softer, in music that is dynamics. In science, volume, what's the definition of volume in science? Huh? Yeah, so it's different. And in dynamics has also a different, diba? Like, do you have our group dynamics is also different. So when we hear those words, it's all different. In music, we also use it in a different term. So that's the reason why we have a lot of these trills. And because the harpsichord you cannot play loud, you cannot play soft. So we had a lot of these things. And I was imitating the harpsichord. So in the harpsichord, there's a lot of... So that excitement, because the strings of the harpsichord were plucked. Okay, now, the 17th century is very important because three German composers, two German composers were born: Johann Sebastian Bach, George Friedrich Handel, composer of Messiah, Hallelujah, diba? And Domenico Scarlatti. But in France, we had Couperin, who was born actually earlier than the three. After the 17th century, I'm going to move on, we now have the 18th century. Now, the 18th century was the time of Mozart. You know, I would tell my students, I would tell everybody, who is the most famous classical composer? Mozart, right? Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Even a non-musician, even someone who does not listen to classical music, there's only one composer. And Mozart is even more famous than Bach, than Johann Sebastian Bach. And you know the reason? Because in the 20th century, you were not born yet, in the 1990s, late 20th century, there were studies done by a lot of psychologists and on the Mozart effect. That if you listen to Mozart, you become a genius. They put students in one class, a group of students in one classroom. They listen to Mozart's D major sonata for two pianos. The other students were listening to rock music. And then they took the IQ test. And the ones who listened to Mozart had a higher IQ. So a lot of studies have done. That's why everybody wanted their children to listen to Mozart. But we are probably wondering why, what happened to France during that time? Because our training in classical music is mainly, we all know the German composers, from Johann Sebastian Bach, and then German-speaking, although Mozart is from Austria, also a German-speaking country. Mozart, we know Beethoven. And then in the 19th century, we call it Romantic period. We also know Schumann, we know Brahms. The German tradition is very strong. Now, the reason why I'm exploring French music is because I wanted to share something new to the public. So, what exactly happened in the 18th century in France? Okay, so Jardin, so another French composer, Hyacinthe Jardin, was born in 1776, died in 1800. So, how old was he? He was only 24 years old. A lot of so Mozart died. I think he was in his. I'm not sure if 39 or 42, but Mozart was born 1756. So Jardin was Mozart is 20 years older, than Jardin. Now, Jardin was one of the first piano professors of the Paris Conservatory. But who has heard of the French Revolution? Yes, I'm sure you've heard it in your history classes. The problem when we have a lot of this revolutions, war, and chaos is the arts will suffer, no? Because students normally cannot go to school, or composers will have to, find other ways of making money. So this was the time of the French Revolution, the classical period. And so that's the reason why we don't know much about this composer. The next, Jardin, I'm going to be reading his composition. His composition is a sonata, Sonata Opus 5, number 1 in F minor. In the classical period, they were very, in the classical period, when you hear music, they rarely used the minor keys. Okay, you would only use the minor key if it's something special. In fact, there is a study that's called key characteristics, that the key of, for example, the key of D minor means death. The key of E flat major means that it's heroic. Okay, then this one is in the key of F minor. But a sonata is something that evolved during the classical period. So don't confuse it with classical music and classical period. Now, in the classical period, a sonata would normally have 3 to 4 movements, and just like when you do your writing assignments, it would have an exposition, okay, and then a development, and then at the end a recapitulation. A recapitulation meaning a conclusion of the sonata. So it was easier, the music during that time, this was the birth of the piano. But during that time they called it forte piano, meaning forte and piano, soft. Now, there weren't much trills during that time, but it was the Alberti bass. So that was the one that developed during the time of Mozart. Now Jardin is very special because his music is virtuosic, yet he hasn't been really discovered as a composer. Okay, the first movement is actually Allegro moderato, to be followed by the second movement, which is Adagio. Okay, and then the last movement, which is I believe the last movement is Presto ba? Let's see. Allegro. The last movement is Allegro. Okay, so when you listen to a sonata, just like when you go to a concert, and so this is an educational experience for us, just like when you go to a concert, what do we do? They teach us that you do not clap in between movements. And how come you cannot do that? Well, during their time, they would clap in between movements, but the intellectuals, they say that, a sonata is a complete thought. So if you clap after the first movement, the story isn't finished. So we have to finish the first part, and then the second part, which is normally slow, and then the fast part. Now, music is abstract. No? So you really just have to imagine what you hear, or if you want, you listen to the differences between the minor themes and the major themes. So for example, I will just play parts of it first. So for example, this one is in minor. And then suddenly, sorry, there. And then suddenly, it becomes major. Okay, so they say that listening to this minor, major, it has that, I think it affects our system, and listening to the scales. The scales is also a classical period compositional technique. During the time of Bach, and they wouldn't really use much of those, but now we are using a lot of this accompaniment and a lot of this scales classical technique. Okay, so when you listen to the sonata, it's a bit long. I think it's around 7 to 10 minutes long. So listen to the first movement, then the second movement, which will be very slow, then the last movement, which will be really fast. Then after you listen to the sonata, I'd like to ask some volunteers if you could tell me what happened during the French Revolution. What were the inventions in science in the 18th century? Okay, if the piano was invented, what were the other inventions during the time? Okay, so just to make you think.